Welcome to CMO Confidential, the podcast that takes you inside the drama, decisions, and choices that go with being the head of marketing. Hosted by five-time CMO Mike Linton.
Welcome, marketers, advertisers, and those who love them, the Chief Marketing Officer Confidential. CMO Confidential is a program that takes you inside the drama, the decisions, and the politics that go with being the head of marketing at any company in what is one of the most scrutinized jobs in the executive suite. I'm Mike Linton, the former Chief Marketing Officer of Best Buy, eBay, Farmers Insurance, and Ancestry.com, here today with my guests, Leesa Eichberger and Amanda Reierson. Today's topic, what your team wants to tell you but won't. Now, Leesa is the former CMO of Jenny Craig and Ring Central and the SVP of Brand Marketing and Sponsorships at Farmers Insurance, one of the longest business cards ever. And Amanda is the former CMO at Avant, head of marketing at Thumbtack, and chief growth officer at Farmers. She is also on the board of Porch. Now, full disclosure, we all worked together at Farmers for a number of years, worked on some pretty good marketing campaigns, at least we thought so, including we know a thing or two since we've seen a thing or two. The Farmers Insurance Open and the complete relaunch of Farmers Digital, which involved the consolidation of 14 websites into one. They both have had numerous teams working for them and reported to many different leaders in their careers. So I think they are very well suited to discuss this topic. Welcome, Amanda and Leesa.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. Great to be here.
All right. Now you both have deep experience in managing teams. How at first do you engage communication health when you look at your team and think about how the information flow is going back and forth?
Amanda, you want to start? You want me to jump in?
Look, I'm happy to start. And thanks for having us, Mike. I feel like the three of us are sitting in your office having a conversation like we did many times, and it's great to be a part of it. Look, I think with communication, especially in this remote world, it can be difficult to gauge communication health at times. You know, I'd say a flag for me when you know maybe health isn't there is if you aren't getting any bad news. So if it's rosy all the time, maybe it's not so rosy and you need to dig a little bit deeper. But you know, any sort of communication that's less formal, so outside of one-on-ones, outside of meetings, where you have a whiteboard or, you know, just getting a cup of coffee with someone, I feel like that's where you get, you know, true sort of employee engagement, and try and find those opportunities when we can.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Amanda, that, you know, the lack of bad news, and I would say too much quiet is a similar thing. I mean, I you know, one of the things, especially in a remote world, I think we do have to recognize a whole different framework of how people communicate, and you don't have the body language or quite all the cues that you might have if you're in a room together. But if there's people you're just not hearing from, that to me is always like what's going on? Or if there's a manager that, you know, someone I'm working for, or, you know, a peer that I'm not hearing from that I should be, that's what's happening. And usually, you know, that kind of puts my spidey senses up to dig in a little bit and try and re-engage through the communication.
Let's follow on that a little bit. When you're reporting to someone, and there is bad news, or there's potential bad news, or there's other things. And some companies are not always that great at taking bad news. Some leaders always maybe not as open as others. When you come into a new gig or you get a new leader, how do you take the risk calculation of how much you communicate or not? And then when do you feel vulnerable or not vulnerable in that relationship?
I think that's a great question. I mean, Amanda and I, having worked together as peers for a certain period of time, that was actually something we would carpool and sometimes talk about, like, how do we discuss this? And I tend to be much more of a open mouth, insert foot, a little bit maybe too straightforward. Amanda's very good at positioning things and thinking that through. And so having someone to talk to about, you know, how do you think we should bring this up is great. So you can kind of role play a little bit. I do tend personally to lean towards the very direct, and that's part of my brand. But, you know, it can be abrupt, I think, and you have to be thoughtful about how it will be absorbed and Couching it in what's good, what's not good. And then one of the things that I do for myself, and I also ask of my employees, if there's bad news or if there's something that's not working, what are ideas on how to fix it? So I'm not just coming in with a problem. I'm coming in with, okay, I think this is not working as well as it should. Here are some ideas of how we might adjust that. So it's not just here's the bad news and I'm out. It's much more of a thoughtful process.
But I do think this practice with someone is really important, because there's no leader that says, I don't have an open door policy, or we want to hear everything. We're all about open communication, transparency, and open door. But that's not always true. Amanda, so you and Leesa would talk about this, but what's your tips in this space?
Yeah, I'd say, look, it's an art, but bring the solution if you can. So, if you're coming in with a problem, or you're coming in feeling vulnerable, or there's bad news or something in the business, whatever you can do to come in with, here's potential solutions or things we could go after, or data that we could seek out to prove it either way. It just makes it less emotional. And more of, okay, how do we sort of band together as thought partners to sort of solve whatever's in front of us as a team, right? I also think what Leesa said is important as far as, confiding in a colleague, or, I've called it almost my board of advisors, which is people in the company and outside the company. So who are those phone calls when you're wrestling with a tough issue or feeling vulnerable? It's always good to run it by somebody with fresh eyes too. I found that to be really helpful, to be able to bounce things off people, find out if I'm in the right headspace about it before sort of taking it back in.
I definitely agree with that. I have that phone a friend thing, which is, you got to give it to someone cold and see what they say, especially if I think it's a risky thing. When you change jobs and you go into a new position, you don't, even you, Leesa, probably don't just tell everything right away. And here's my observation. How do you test the waters in your new company or with your new leader and your new team to see what they can and can't take?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I was given some advice when I first took my role at Jenny Craig from my boss at Vonage that was really helpful. And I've used this, and I've given it to other people, and I've used it myself. And one of that, when you're in a new environment, you keep a list of the things that are like head scratchers and like a little weird, or that feel like way off base. And if they're weird after a few weeks or even a month, they maybe actually are weird. Sometimes, though, you're just not understanding.
I'm going to ask you to give me a weird example. So, I mean,
more than 30 days.
I don't know if I have a great example, but I do think that taking a moment to understand the culture, and if what you're seeing is something that you're misjudging or making too much of a snap judgment on, is really, really important. I think taking time to assess a situation, to understand the teams. People are going to be on their best behavior a lot of times, and that's that creates an interesting environment. People are going to be more extreme potentially. I mean, I think all of us have done DISC testing, which is something I actually love, and they're going to be like more extreme in their negatives and their positives potentially of their personalities when you first start working with them. So getting an understanding for really what's going on under the surface before you make a snap judgment is really critical.
And if you haven't done a DISC, it's a how you lead and how you manage standpoint. It allows you to understand differently of the different styles and different ways people come at you with discussion and how they process problems. Amanda, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, no, I agree. I once had somebody tell me, Amanda, respect the culture, like on one of my first days there, meaning, look, there's certain ways to do things around the company. And to Lisa's point, a lot of times you have to sort of hang back and understand the context before, you move forward with something. I look at sort of relationships and even vulnerability. It's a long game of, okay, get in, dig in, understand your counterparts, your team, your leads, your boss, sort of what is their agenda, vulnerabilities. And then, I think creating those relationships. So full disclosure, that DISC, I am an influencer, which means I am a people person, like square in the middle. I know that about myself, but to me, relationships are truly your currency. And if you don't take the time to sort of get those right and understand each other, I think it's really hard to succeed as an executive in a company.
Yeah, I think, Farmers, which was such a great opportunity for us to learn about that too, because Mike, you brought in kind of a newer team into a established culture. I mean, I've told this often. When I joined, I had 2 employees working for me who had over 40 years tenure each at the company. And Farmers had built itself. It was a 90-year-old company, or 80-something-year-old when we joined, with some established culture that had really, really worked. But they also needed to make some changes. So respecting that original culture, respecting what allowed them to work while bringing in new thinking it was a challenge, but it was critical. And that's why I think we were able to be as successful as we were, is because we didn't throw out the old to bring in new. We merged the two together.
I agree with that. I think 2 things. The culture got the company to where it was, and they were good enough to hire you. It can't be all bad. Even if you were brought in to do all the changes, they're big enough to hire you and pay for you and move you or whatever. So you got to respect that. And 2, if you outrun the culture will not do anything for you. So the culture probably has to keep up. So we're kind of talking about some best and worst practices. If you go into your bag of tricks and say, here's our Hall of Fame best practices and comms, both up and down, and Hall of Fame worst things you've ever seen, or things to never do, what would you say are in that bag of communication tools?
Well, I'm thinking through some, things that have stuck out to me as bad communication practices. And, I once had a team member, and I wasn't in the room. This sort of predates Farmers by a number of years. And that person was given feedback by another business leader in front of a whole room of people. Yeah. And, I feel like that if you think about communication and trust and vulnerability, it's so important to think through, what is that right setting where I'm going to be able to communicate something as a manager, or have something communicated to me where it's going to sink in and feel productive, even if it isn't the feedback you were necessarily expecting or want. To get it, feedback is a gift, right? To be able to make yourself better and grow is so important, but that setting is so important. And I think a contradiction of that is Mike, one of my first days at Farmers. So Mike kind of has this way of coming into your office, almost like Kramer-esque, Seinfeld reference. The door shuts and okay, it's coming. But with Mike, and I think Leesa, you'd probably agree, it was welcome feedback, and it was always given in a productive way. Even if, and I to even share what it was, I believe it was one of my first days on the job, and we were in a meeting with a big supplier, and I didn't say much because I was new and I was listening and I was bringing it in, to just react. And Mike, you had said, look, I hired you to get on the field and play. Oh, by the way, Mike also has a lot of sports references. So get on the field and play. You're a player. You weren't sort of hired to sit in the stands. And I really appreciated that. And I always remembered that. And I also appreciated the fact that it was delivered one-on-one and right away after the meeting. Yeah. So real-time feedback.
Thanks. And the Kramer reference I'm going to take only as good. That I did have a CEO go unnamed who used to, in public, we would all have to rate the other functions in front of them, which I think that was really quite unhelpful, I thought.
One way to do it.
Leesa, how about your best and worst?
Yeah, I got from a worst case. It's funny. This is one I hadn't thought of for a while, and I don't know where it just came from in my memory banks. But my first ad agency job, which I was 22 years old, I think, I had a manager who we were doing performance evaluations, and I think this gets to Amanda's point on feedback in the moment. It was time to do the performance evaluation, and she sits me down and she said, I'd given you a really strong performance evaluation, but you made me really mad last night, so I changed all the scores. And that was a learning opportunity for me of, okay, this is not how you manage people. This is not a productive way to make me feel good about anything or to make anyone feel good about it. And I think the flip side of that is the management in the moment. There's that book, The 1 Minute Manager, which was so popular however long ago, that it talks about that. Mike, I think you were always good about it. And it's something I've tried to emulate is, if there's something good, tell people right away. If there's something negative, also tell them right away. And I think, the good stuff, maybe you can tell that more publicly, but the bad stuff, it's worth taking someone aside and not berating them in the room, and making it very much about, are you open to some feedback? Here are some things that I think could help you perform better, and even, why were you that? Why did you do this? What was the thinking? What were you trying to accomplish? And in a way that's not accusatory, but it's just, thinking about improving them and making them have a better experience.
Got it. Thank you. Let's flip the script a little bit and say you get into a company that actually doesn't like bad news. We've all seen them. They just don't want to hear the bad news, or there's the, electric fence issue where you can't say these folks over here are really actually a good competitor and their value equation may be better than ours. How do you manage in a company where that situation is there when you are trying to communicate things that are running into they're either bad news or they're going to run into the electric fence? What are tips?
Tips to not run into the buzzsaw?
Yes.
Yeah. So look, bad news is never fun. I think what I've learned is nobody ever likes to be surprised. So, communicate bad news as quickly as you can. Even if you don't have a solution, like get it up and out. So with next steps. With that said, like you said, Mike, not all cultures are necessarily open to the bad news. So, as a leader, you've got to get it out there, right? Because likely that bad news is something that if you can get over it, you'll have business gain. Come again sort of with the solution of, okay, here's what we're seeing with the competitor, but here might be an idea of how we might combat it. Or, here's what we're seeing in terms of sales, and I don't think I'm going to be able to hit these targets because of X, Y, and Z. But if we put this on the table, it could be an interesting test. So again, coming with the bad news has been a strategy that's worked for me in the past.
Yeah. I would. Oh, go ahead, Leesa.
Oh, no, go ahead. Please.
My other thing about bad news is a lot of times it's like a cavity. If you ignore it, it only gets worse. And you got to figure out a way to tell the company it has a cavity. And a lot of times it just doesn't want to hear it.
I think there's two things that are interesting. I mean, to Amanda's point, no surprises, I think is critical. That to me is the worst thing you can do is surprise somebody with hey, we just missed, or, oh, we're over budget, before there's an opportunity to kind of rally the troops and make some decisions. That to me is really, really important on keeping people apprised. And then I think it's coming up with, to Amanda's point again, solutions and tests of how you might work your way into other ideas, whether that's recognizing the competition's strengths and saying, hey, they did this. What have we thought about that would be either white space that's different or something we might do that's similar, to help us advance, and get to that next step.
Yeah. So fact-based, analytical, and also always with the next step. Never go in with with no next step. But let's talk about, we've all had a lot of bosses. When you think your boss is doing the wrong thing or is driving down the wrong path, either strategically or a big executional issue, how do you decide first whether to tell them or not that you think it's doing wrong, especially if it's not quite in your space? If it's in your space, yes, you can have the argument. But if it's one over, or it's somewhere else, or you're thinking, oh my God, my boss is going to go in front of the board and get slaughtered, how do you decide whether to tell them or not? And then if you decide yes, how do you do it?
I have a hard time, I think, not engaging if there's something that I see that's wrong. So maybe I could be more judicious in saying, have you thought about that? But at the same time, I think being straightforward is really important. So I'm pretty comfortable saying, I'm not sure I agree with this. I think it's worth bringing, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And then going back to, and I think, we've said this at Farmers, I've said it at other companies, if you don't get to a point where there's alignment, disagree and commit. We have the conversations behind closed doors. We can have the betting our heads or whatever it may be. If we're not aligned, come to a place where we say, okay, I don't love that you're doing it this way, but I'm in. Like, now that we've decided as a team, I'm in. I mean, I think it's a little bit like mom and dad dealing with kids. Like, you're better off having a united front in front of everyone and have those hard conversations kind of back behind the closed doors. And sometimes, you hope you're wrong if you don't agree with the direction.
Amanda, I know you've been in those spots too. So what's your advice to our listeners?
Yeah, no, I think that disagree and commit thought is a really good one. So as a leader, I definitely want to create an environment where people can bring counterpoints, as well as I, definitely have been known to bring counterpoints to sort of my supervisors. I think it's healthy, but, and as a leader, I want to create that environment where people feel comfortable. With that said, I do think even going back to sort of the data and solutions points, that can come in handy here too of, I don't agree with you on this, or here's another way to think about it. Here's a question the board may ask that maybe we're not ready for. And it's not you, it's the team. Making it sort of less personal and more about sort of us as a team and the business goals we're all looking to achieve is helpful too, versus sort of, going after sort of one individual for one thing.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, if you look good, I look good, right? So that's something too that, as long as you can sort of keep the team in sort of our mutual shared goals surface, then I find that helps. Of like, this is the end goal here, and I have a thought on how we might want to do things differently, or an obstacle we might face based on how we've sort of positioned something or set it up.
Well, there's definitely, you both talked me out of a bunch of stuff when we worked together, and I was always grateful for that. Is there any story you want to share about when your team talked you out of something and opened your eyes to something you didn't see?
That is a great question. I'll actually give a farmer's example. So we launched a lot of digital tools, websites in a time where a lot of sales, if there's an insurance company, were based on sort of human relationships, and the agent relationships. We also introduced digital tools. There were times where we would build something because, consumers may have wanted it, but it may not have necessarily fit with the farmer's culture or the agent relationships. And I had times when the team would come to me and say, look, like, our relationships with sales is so important that maybe this digital thing might be a step too far for the culture at the moment. Yeah. And let's hear it, because the relationships of my team and their counterparts was so important to them too. So there were actually a couple of instances where maybe we sort of slowed the launch of things to make sure that the company was ready, and our, sort of the relationships we had around the company would be preserved as a result. And that doesn't mean you can't launch it, but maybe just give it a little more time to breathe, and make sure that you're looking at sort of all the factors around you, the business.
Got it. Thanks. Anything else on that?
I'm sure I have plenty if I could think of them. I don't have any that come to mind immediately, except really similar examples to Amanda's, where it's like, here's a change that I'm recommending, and I'm not thinking through that the speed might not be something the company's ready for. And so being, kind of talked down of like, hey, we've been doing it this way for however long, it's not that broken, and fixing or changing or adjusting it like too fast is actually sometimes a problem. So slow the roll and figure out. I do think that goes back to do it in pieces.
I do think that goes back really to the earlier discussion we had about culture, which is you can't outrun the culture. You have to go as fast as it will let you. Which is, when we changed the logo, for example, we took a long time to let the company bite into that so they would accept it. Same thing when we smashed all the websites together, because that was not, there's 14 websites into one. There was a lot of people that were pretty wed to their one website. And so that was pretty much, you had to go as fast as the culture would let you and no faster. And having to your earlier points, the relationships out there to tell you, are you going too fast or not? Really, is super important to not outrunning the company.
And putting, I think, testing and learning too. So let me show you and put like a little bit of points on the board before we scale something that might seem foreign. So that test and learn culture comes with trust too, but how do you like effectively pace in and we can learn together versus trying to sort of sell something.
Well, which is what you did when we started the website thing. What we said is we're just our first goal is just to get NPS to 0. Net promoter score to 0. That was not a big, and if we can't do that, well, okay, we'll go away.
No, I think that, Amanda, your point on trust is such a big one, because I think that test and learn can build trust, and you need it. You need to test and learn, and that creates trust, and then you need trust to be able to test and learn. But that you can take these baby steps that actually build something much larger and more substantial, and gives you credibility and a little more like just gravitas in the room when you come in, and you've already built those step by step, where people can believe that you're thinking things through, and it's not a knee-jerk reaction or just coming in to make change.
Got it. Hey, we're running towards the end of time here. We have our last question that it's a 2-parter. You each have to take at least one or both, but you have to take at least one, and it's funniest story you can tell on the air and or practical advice we haven't discussed yet about this topic. You can take one or both, but you each have to take at least one.
I've been thinking about this one, Mike, because I know you end all of your podcasts with this, and I have one that I think everybody has experienced. That's kind of a funny story, but also practical advice, and that's the communicating via email without being thoughtful. And I have a situation back to my kind of first ad agency job, back before computers were password protected, of doing a reply all that should not have been a reply all on something that probably shouldn't have been put in writing, and realizing at the 11th hour, oh man, I just sent an email to my boss saying something completely inappropriate, and trying to figure out how to run into his office and get onto his computer and delete the email before he had a chance to see it.
So much of us wants to hear exactly what was in that email. So many of our listeners want
to. Inquiring minds want to know.
Yeah, that gets back to being, but it's practical advice and a funny story. Like, don't put things in email that you wouldn't say out loud, and don't hit send until you're sure it's going to the right people.
Sounds like a Hall of Fame bad email. I so want to know.
It probably was. And bunch of 22-year-olds running around an ad agency. You can just imagine like the sorts of things that should and shouldn't be said. But I think it's being thoughtful in communication of how you want to be perceived. When you get back to practical advice, like, is this something that I want to be part of my brand? Probably not. Don't put it in email.
But also those kind of mistakes where you get viewed as maybe not all the a great team player shuts down future communication. So
right,
good advice, Amanda. You get to close us out.
Yeah, I think. Isn't there something like if you wouldn't want it on the cover of the New York Times, like don't
put it in an email. Yeah,
sleep on it. Another piece of advice I've even told interns coming in sort of all the way up through is it's okay to say, I don't know. Like if you're asked a question in the boardroom, if you're asked a question in a one-on-one team meeting, anything, no one has all the answers all the time. And sure, you should go find the answer, especially if it's an important question, but it shows a vulnerability of, hey, I'm confident in myself to say, like, I don't know the answer to that right now, but I will find it. Or, sort of maybe the knowledge is there in the room. So that's something I've always taken with me. And oh my gosh, funny story. So the funny thing about me, one of my tells is if I'm really cracking up, I actually tear up and cry. They're like happy tears. And we had so many of those moments working together. I think one Mike and I talk about is we were filming something for employee communications, and for whatever reason, I just decided to completely go off script, and the person that was running the show was not happy, but Mike and I were just sort of crying because it was so
cried
funny.
For like 10 minutes.
Oh my goodness.
You were so happy you wept almost 10 minutes.
Right. And I don't know why I went off script like that. What a irritating actor in that, thing that someone had worked very hard on. But I just appreciate those times, and I appreciate humor so much, and so important for relationships and building things together. So
I do think this don't make it up thing is super important as a leader, because if your team thinks you're making up answers, that is really a thing. Then they can't actually tell you problems if you're not going to debate. If you tell them you think you know the answer and you don't, that creates a really bad team dynamic, I think. So anyways, we're at show time. So thank you, Amanda and Leesa, and thanks to everyone for listening to CMO Confidential. If you are enjoying our show, please like, share, and subscribe. And look for all of our shows on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and the I Hear Everything Network. These shows include Marketing, the battle between believers and non-believers, parts 1, 2, and 3. Is the CMO position the hardest job in business? The case for customer lifetime value, why is this so hard? And is artificial intelligence an extinction event for agencies? Hey, all you marketers, stay safe out there. This is Mike Linton signing off for CMO Confidential.